Yeah, militance basically to me means the willingness to work towards revolutionary change, okay, as humanely as possible. I'm obviously I'm a very ethical person. I don't want to see violence, but violence is being committed against us, and the genocide that is now being planned for the young is violence at its most extraordinary extreme form. To say that we cannot, or the young cannot use violence for their survival is to me absurd and completely unethical.
Yes. Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Music today from Michael Hedges, as always, and also Port Blue Into the Sea. Also available on our website, www.livingresilience.net, is a wide array of articles, online learning series, arranging group and individual resilience coaching, and sign up for our every other Tuesday free support group that we call Safe Circle Calls. I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. When you think of a bold voice in activism today, who do you think of? You know, for me, one of the first voices is Roger Hallam or other folks from XR or perhaps Greta Thunberg. This is today's episode is a conversation with Frank ROTERING. He's one of the most bold and new and remarkable voices in activism that I've heard ever. So I look forward to hearing your reactions to Frank ROTERING. All right, welcome everybody to another round of the Poetry of Predicament podcast. And this is Saturday, March 26th of 2022. And I'm really pleased to be speaking with Frank ROTERING. And I've just stumbled into Frank's work off of a tweet on Twitter, and it was particularly apt, and I don't remember the thread, so that I'm gonna have to let that go. But what really has gripped me since I followed the thread to your book, Frank, was this Youth Ecological Revolution, a handbook for leaders. And then the subsequent comments that we've exchanged in emails. And we were just this moment, as we were getting to know each other before hitting the record button, starting to compare notes about, yeah, I had a little concern about this, but then you responded with that. And what about this over here? So there's this interesting way in which it just seems to me we both have a particular intensity and very clear focus for ourselves on what is our work, what is our track.
Right.
And the more I've dived in, the more I'm not finished with your book, but I've started it. And the more I dive into what seems to be your thread, the more I think there's a tremendous overlap. And I'm particularly inspired by and intrigued by your own self-description that you have, I think you said kind of a bit on the spectrum, kind of a intensity of focus is what I heard in the words you used. And
right.
And I just so appreciate that, really starting with Greta Thunberg, who is self-declared on the spectrum herself. And there's such an important truth-telling going on. And it really seems that is at the core of what you're talking about, whether it's about activism or about the reality that we're all facing in terms of the actual human-caused predicaments on the planet. So I'm really looking forward to you letting us know what you're up to. What is your way of seeing how it is that you relate with the world,
Right.
how it's going. It just seems really exciting. I'm at a very exciting early place in your book, and I'm really looking forward to finding out more about you, your organization, your book. So welcome here.
Okay, thank you very much. There is no organization, by the way. It is simply moi.
All right.
That's it. But I think you started things off correctly. What is the root of our intensity? And I'll start with myself, and I'd like to know from you too where you get your depth of commitment. I am, as you've indicated, I'm not clinically on the spectrum, by the way. It's a self-diagnosis. I took some internet quizzes, and I'm well within the ASPE range. But I'm not clinically Asperger's or autistic, okay? And I'm certainly high functioning. Yeah, for me, the ASPE aspect of my personality is very important. It points to an extreme social isolation. I got to say that. I have no friends. I have very few acquaintances. I'm very much a thinker, and very much an independent thinker. And I'm going to explain later on exactly what that means in terms of social control and capitalism and the corruption that you talked about with Jacobson. So the social isolation is to me very important, because I found in life that people influence you. Friends influence you, family influence you. And I've been very, very careful to stay away from being unduly affected by those influences. Mm-hmm. So what you stated about me came from I think the preface to the first edition of my book. There's now a second edition out, which identified me as a bit of an ASPE and an independent thinker. And that is rooted in an experience I had, which is very difficult to describe. Maybe you had something similar, but back in my teen years, when I was about 14 or 15, I had what could only be called, I think in today's language, an epiphany. And it wasn't a thunderbolt. It was just a realization of my ethical responsibility to the world, just an ethical posture, an ethical commitment. And I didn't really understand it then. It's sort of played itself out through my life. But definitely there is a very early life experience that set me on this particular course of very socially isolated thinking, intense thinking about humankind, about nature, about our future, and predominantly my ethical responsibilities. And if you look at my book, you'll find that the word ethics or ethical comes up again and again and again, because that is my lodestar, my ethical duty to this world. So that is sort of my, inspiration, or afflatus is a good word. What about you? Where do you get your intensity? You have a background in psychology and then this training, but where's the intensity come from?
Yeah. I pretty much had it all my life, pathologically, as a reaction to trauma early on in my life. So it wasn't a pleasant thing to be, an intensity to be around through my early adulthood. But I did lots and lots of work to clear that up as best I could. And that intensity is now just lives for me as a vibrant aliveness, and it still can come across very intense to people, but I think there's a lot less anger and armoring from trauma and all that stuff. So
can I ask you a question? Are you talking physical trauma or mental trauma, psychological trauma?
A whole lot of psychological trauma, relatively small amount of physical trauma.
Okay. But you don't want to get more specific than that.
I could. I don't know that it's really useful for the conversation, but
Okay.
I don't. I'm happy to share as much as you might like to know about. Is there a specific kind of question or direction I could go for you?
Just give me a hint if you don't mind. Like what happened? Were you abused? Did you have a near-death experience, or
Yeah.
a psychedelic experience? What was it?
Yeah. Well, I grew up in a household with just myself and my alcoholic mother for the first, I don't know, 13 years of my life. And she was full on, off the wall, acting out alcoholics. Every 2 to 3 days, there'd be the event, whatever it was, and
Right.
roll the dice what it was.
Yeah.
And so there was that in terms of psychological trauma. That was plenty. Then there was a little bit of physical trauma in there of being beat a bit by a ex-father, a stepfather, and so on. But more meaningfully, you mentioned a couple of other possibilities, and yes, you asking about psychedelics. Yes, I actually found, when my mother got married to the last man that she was with, and he's my adopted father, it was like night and day. He was just one of the most integral persons I've ever met. He was just a loving, great man.
Right.
And I got to leave him with my mom to handle all of that. And he did that with love and beauty. And I got to go and be with nature. And that's what I did. I was living in San Diego, and I had a few power spots that I would go to in the desert and the cliffs of Torrey Pines, and also down in Baja quite a bit.
Right.
And from about mid-teens up through my early 30s, I participated in my own practices and also led others in plant medicine journeys.
Okay.
And so that was really, I think, if there was a catalyzing element that took me from being a wounded young man, just angry and armored, to being intense with a direct connection to life and earth-based connection, it was through those psychedelics and through the shamanic and energetics work that really has continued to today.
Interesting. My guess wasn't far off then. Okay.
Yeah, not
That's
at all.
interesting. Yeah, okay. Well, thank you for that. That helps me actually deal, with you as a person and understand you better. So, okay.
So if I may, I'd like to just bring a little bit of the kind of baseline in my experience that got rattled in a good way by our interactions and the original reading of the first few pages of your book. And there are a few, I keep track of some of the elements of activism around the world, particularly XR really got my attention. And I think that there's a lot to like about Roger Hallam's just kind of grittiness and directness and so on. There are a few other people that I also put into the mix of just tracking, as I know we're all just doing our best to figure out how the hell do we find a way to actually move anything in a significant way, given what we're facing.
Okay, let me stop you there and make a comment about Hallam, and XR.
Okay, because I know you're going there, and that's what I want you to do. Okay. The last thing I would say is, what rattled me in a good way is when you came back and said, you mentioned about Hallam, and I'll tell you, Hallam is an example of, and this is where I know you're going to go right now, and I'm happy about that. And this is also where I realized I had misjudged you. I had really put you into the camp that I encounter so many times in people that I talk with, either on this podcast or in my own conversations, where they think they know what I'm talking about. When I say the word transformative, they think they know what I'm talking about, and way more often than not, they don't. And it's they use the word, they should be using the word change, and they're using the word transformative as if, because right now I can go onto the internet and buy a pair of socks that's supposed to be able to transform me.
Right,
So we
right.
both know these things will get
Yeah,
commodified. So
yeah.
I'm so interested to hear a guy that I consider to be one of the grittiest characters out there in activism today.
Yeah.
And he's still not quite making the mark in terms of what you're talking about when you're speaking to youth, taking full responsibility and stepping up and taking this
Right.
on. So could you speak to what it is that, tell us about that baseline that you're creating?
Hallam, let me deal with Hallam and XR because it's a good jumping off point. I know Roger Hallam quite well. We've talked, of course, on the web. He has invited me several times to have an interview, which he's canceled every time, by the way. But the problem with Hallam and XR and most of the activism out there is that they're fighting the last war. And you say you've read my first 20 pages. It's in those first 20 pages, the first chapter, where I directly address potential youth leaders. And I tell them the first thing you must not do is fight the last war. That's being a very bad general. And the last war in this context is social justice. Of course, it's an ongoing thing. I'm not dismissing it, but I'm saying that Hallam, XR, etc., progressive generally, activists generally, are aiming towards the justice side of things and employing justice-related tactics, ideas, strategies, etc. So the baseline here is that I don't reject social justice, but we now face an existential ecological crisis which deals with the limits of nature, not the structure or behavior of society. And those are two qualitatively different things. And if you apply Hallam's intensity, which is there, and the grittiness, which is there for sure, he's a very admirable person in that domain, but it doesn't transfer into the domain we're dealing with, ecological disaster. And he has not been able to make in any way, shape, or form that transition. He is a die-hard social justice activist. And that's what bothers me about Hallam, is that he's fighting the last war and he's not willing to contemplate that there is a new war to fight. So that's the baseline.
Can you help me understand just a bit, if not that justice-laden track that you're saying that Hallam's on, what would it look like if it was closer to what you're talking about?
Well, you have to first understand the reality of political power. Okay, can I put up a slide here? Okay, so this, in a sense, is my baseline right here. This diagram. This is from chapter 5 in my book, as you can see, figure 5-1, political power under capitalism. Now, that's the world I live in. Okay. So what we have at the bottom there is the populace, that's you and me and Roger Hallam and everybody else. And representing that populace is a government, okay? Now, the standard story that unfortunately Hallam and many others believe is that that is basically politics right there. The populace elects a government. If they don't like what the government is doing, like not solving an ecological crisis, they can elect new people, a new government, and things should be okay. I completely reject that. I think that is simply a false picture of reality. And my study, which takes me through Marx and all that stuff over decades now, tells me that on top of that structure, that basic electoral structure, there is a deep structure of capitalist power, starting with a capitalist ruling class, which delegates authority to a state, which we normally call government agencies. And that state exercises the social control that you and Ella Jacobson talked a lot about. It's this control, the control of the message. Well, it's that red, can I do this here? Hang on a second. If I click here, yeah. So right here, you see the pointer there?
Yes.
Okay. So this right here, this is the capitalist world, the ruling class and the state exercising control over us. And the lies come through this conduit right here. I don't want to get into details of this. We're just trying to establish a baseline here. So we're talking about Hallam and XR and activism generally and its limitations. And the main problem is that they limit themselves to this purple area at the bottom, which is real, it exists, and it's significant, but it's only a small part of the political reality we face. Now, under normal circumstances, when we're dealing with social justice, when we're not dealing with an existential crisis like we are today, we can in fact ignore much of this stuff up here. It is superfluous to our day-to-day understanding. But we are not in that situation. We're being threatened with ecological collapse. And in that context, if you ignore this reality up here, you are helpless. And XR, as led by Roger Hallam, is helpless for that reason. They have tried to concoct a strategy, these representative institutions or popular assemblies, which basically amplify the power or the strength of government, but completely ignores this structure on top of here. So that is the baseline. Okay, I believe in capitalist power, and the people, the standard progressives, do not. They believe in government power. A fundamental distinction.
Got it. So can you take it one level closer to what it would look like? So let's just say Roger Hallam gets a come to Jesus moment. The skies crack open, he gets clear, and his orientation of his attention and his action goes in some way toward that upper structure of the capitalist and military and so on. What would it look like? How would we interact with those elements in the model you're talking about?
How would we? I'm sorry, I don't quite get the question. Are you asking me what Roger would do?
Sure. What I'm, if maybe the three of us are activists and we're sitting around a table and saying, okay, what's the next expression of our little activist group? How would it be different than what Hallam has been talking about for the past 3-4 years in particular, since he's been on his own?
Well, first of all, he's not young. He is not young, and my book is titled Youth Ecological Revolution.
Right.
And why the young? Well, because they're going to die. As the standard placard or sign says during youth assemblies or protests, you'll die of old age, we'll die of climate change. And that captures a real deep reality that they're the ones who are going to suffer and die by far more than you and I, who will be dead in 10, 20, 30 years, whatever. Sure. Okay. So the young are at the core of this, okay? And my book is titled Youth Ecological Revolution for that reason. So the first thing about Roger Hallam, as for you and me, is that we are not young, and youth leaders would have to vet us to make sure that we are reliable. Right. Because as I point out in chapter 1, which you've read, by default, we have to distrust have to distrust a lot of people because they've been extremely unreliable and have led them into this genocidal crisis, right? So the first thing that has to happen is the young need to form militant movements. They need to take my work and improve on it, if necessary, and then form militant movements, and then look at people like you, like Roger Hallam, like many other very good people, and ask, are these people capable of helping us strategically?
Yes.
And I do confess in the book that the young, although they must take full responsibility for their ecological survival, they will need help from the older. There's no question about that. They don't have the education, the depth, the experience, so they will need the Roger Hallam's. But they would have to then test Roger Hallam. Do you meet our requirements? And in Roger's case, of course, he doesn't today. So if he were to flip, as you say, become clear and flip and adopt the perspective I just laid out for you, then yeah, then he could become a youth leader, and he would be then forming militant movements. He would be repudiating his government focus. He would be admitting that there is a ruling class, that there is a capitalist state which controls that there is a military which plays a very important role, although we on the left, progressives, tend to ignore the military. They're just bad people, but they're a fundamental social force which we must take into account. That's why it's prominent in my diagram. So Roger Hallam, and in his leadership of XR, would then turn towards that model and say, okay, what do we do? Well, we have to influence the military. We have to somehow come up with a new economic theory, because right now we're laboring under capitalism. It's been proven to be ecocidal. We need a new economic theory. Let's get the intellectuals working on a new economic theory. And of course, I have a starting point for that, which we may talk about if we have time. So Roger would have a whole different set, a whole different perspective, a whole different model of political reality in his head. And he would be looking towards building militant, not reformist youth movements.
Can you say more about that word militant? I mean, obviously, the first thing that comes to mind is that everything up till now has been in virtually every activist group that has any scale is nonviolent direct action.
Right.
So
I reject that.
I got it. And so would you take us from nonviolent direct action to what you're calling a militant action?
Yes.
A militant active group.
Definitely.
What would it look like? What would the differences be?
The difference would be that it would be open to violence if necessary. Okay, so I define militants. It's in my glossary. I hope you find. Do you ever find Appendix G, the glossary? It's the back of the book.
I didn't. It actually isn't in mine. So I'll find that later. We'll talk about it.
Okay,
you'll set me straight.
That is very weird.
Keep going.
Okay. So yeah, militants basically to me means the willingness to work towards revolutionary change, okay, as humanely as possible. I'm a very ethical person. I don't want to see violence, but violence is being committed against us, and the genocide that is now being planned for the young is violence at its most extraordinary extreme form. To say that we cannot, or the young cannot use violence for their survival is to me absurd and completely unethical.
Yes.
It is the non-violence that is unethical to me, not the violence.
Yes.
If it is strategically justified,
yes,
and if it's as humane as the survival objective requires.
Yes.
So it has to be strategically justified and humane. But given those conditions, violence must be accepted in activism if the young want to survive and not merely wave their arms and march, but actually survive, make the necessary changes. Yes. That is a militant revolutionary task, whether we like it or not. This is not a matter of Frank's preference. Right. This is a matter of the situation we face, the genocide the young are beginning to experience, and the only moral reaction to that is a militant stance and a revolutionary movement.
Yeah. So let's just take a pause for a moment. When you and I, before we hit the record button in this conversation, we were just kind of sharing back and forth and getting to know each other a little bit. This is where I think we overlap the most boldly. There are two pieces that you've mentioned. One is, it's not the word you used, this is often how I describe it, our distraction with justice issues.
Right.
When obviously the core existential issues are so vastly more important and more prominent. So I think we agree and overlap there tremendously.
Okay.
And more importantly, at an even larger scale, really at the center of also why I named my book The Impossible Conversation, which I quite embarrassingly admitted to you before we got going. When I finished writing up the book, I ended up softening my stance so radically. It was my first book. I needed to think, what will the people really listen to? I couldn't possibly put the rawness of what I am aware of here in this book. So there's like a breath of reassuring fresh air in hearing how you describe what our situation is, and specifically about the scale of violence and trauma that this planet is under, and every single human being is under the constructs that we've created and now call business as usual. And then how you extend that into surgically, meticulously, thoughtfully put together. If violence is called for, so it shall be. And there's, again, something so refreshingly, boldly true for me about what you're saying, that is an essential overlap that I wanted to be sure and pause when we got here. So here we are.
Okay, no, good.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
I'm glad it sort of helped you accept that is a necessity.
Oh, absolutely.
And again, not as a matter of our personal choices. We're both clearly very ethical people who feel deeply about nature and humankind.
Yeah.
And that is the exact reason why violence must, under the conditions I cited, be accepted. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, it's basically, as I state in chapter 1, a white flag. We're simply saying, these words are coming out of our mouths, but here's the white flag. We're not really serious. We're not going to take you on. Yeah. We're going to let you kill us. No way. Yeah. Violence to us, violence to you if necessary. Definitely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So again, I just gonna for my own sake, I'm just gonna slow down my own pacing, in my own breathing, my own speaking right now for just a moment.
Okay.
To let this anchor in. For me, this is not just conversation. This isn't just finding out about a guy named Frank and he wrote a book and okay, well, now let's move on to the what happens in the later chapters and so on. There are certain elements that really have a particular intent. They have a particular clarity of purpose and a clarity of core, like they earn a place at the core of the human experience. And I think what you're talking about and what we are both embracing to some degree in this conversation right here is a part of that core, and a part of that core that just never gets talked about.
Right.
So again, that's part of the refreshing boldness of what is at the core of your book and plan and so on. When I say those words, are you inspired in any way to share with us where they came from for you, how you landed there, how this has shown up, or is there any other thread that you are inclined to take from here?
Well, again, the source is this ethical epiphany I had in my youth. And because I'm a working class person, that was initially expressed through a working class revolutionary perspective. But right around 1985, I became aware of the ecological crisis. So I've been at this for a while, like you have. And as the Soviet Union fell in the early 90s, and it was clear that socialism / communism had severe problems, at the time I read Gorbachev's books, Perestroika, etc., to find out, because he was very clear what was happening inside the Soviet Union.
Mhm.
So I shifted away from, I shifted away from a working class Marxist revolutionary focus, and I began to see that the real crisis, and I didn't realize it was going to be this extreme, but the crisis is, the fundamental crisis we face is environmental.
Mhm.
And any class conflicts we can pick up after we solve this fundamental crisis. Okay. Yeah. So I'm sorry, what else were you asking about?
Really just opening up the door wide open for you to follow that thread, which I appreciate hearing about how it came to be.
Right.
Out from here, what else is there to say in terms of how real is it that any young people are going to pick up your thread? How's it going? How does it look?
Oh, terrible.
Yeah.
Terrible.
I was afraid you would say that.
Yeah. No, there is absolutely no pickup at all. I mean, I can see the conditions are changing clearly, but the social control over these people is so powerful. And half of my book is about the deceptions that people are facing, the control that they face. It is so powerful. And of course, we're dealing here not with social justice. We're not dealing here with strikes or pay or unions or, getting rid of sexism. We're dealing here with getting rid of capitalism. And the famous saying is, it's easier to imagine the end of civilization or the world than the end of capitalism. So there's this tremendous lack of imagination in people's minds. They simply can't wrap their minds around the end of capitalism, the end of the ruling class that we currently have. All of that has to go away. And that for most people is simply impossible to deal with. And the young are being led by the nose by these reformist organizations like XR. XR was, in a sense, was a bold move, activist-wise, but it has played the standard social control role. And I'll tell you what that is, because it's very important to my way of thinking about this. If you want to deceive intelligent, concerned people, what you do is you attract them with a message. I feel your pain. Yes, there is a crisis. Yes, we have to reduce emissions. You are right. So you suck them in, by attracting them, and then you divert them. So yes, you're right. So go over here and join this march.
And here's this Green New Deal that you might be interested in.
Or that's right. Green New Deal is a perfect example of this kind of diversion.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the main problem. The IPCC is an expert at this. I mean, the IPCC is basically a huge data dump every 7 years, which says, we, the world scientists, understand this. How dare you? Okay, we've got 5,000 pages in the last AR 2014. I counted them, 5,000 pages, unreadable. I've tried. It's a big data dump, and it basically says you must believe us, right? And now that you believe us, we're going to tell you to reduce emissions and do nothing else.
Yeah.
Well, and this happens again and again. So what happens with XR and Roger Hallam? Young people, or people like you, a lot of older people as well, say we need to do something. What's out there? XR is out there. We join it. And XR leads you down the garden path with government reforms or, citizens' assemblies, whatever it is.
Yeah.
So it's that attract to grab people and that divert them to channels that are not threatening to this system, this ruling class, this status quo.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I get that you've really put in the time and the thought to put together this book, and it's I consider it quite strong, and I look forward to finishing it and connecting with you some more. I'm curious how much projection into the future you've done. Would this would this revolution yield the same number of nation states, with each with their own government, or would this become
I have no idea.
A world government?
No, I have not projected that because I think that's really beyond my purview.
Me too. This is obviously conjecture, but
yeah, it's arm waving, and I don't wave my arms. I'm explicit and analytical. Okay, so I don't know about that future, but since you asked the question, I would say the nation states will largely remain as they are. A unified world government is not in the offing. And in that connection, in chapter 4, my chapter 4 is about human nature, another thing that progressives and activists completely tend to ignore, okay, which they cannot do under current circumstances. Okay.
I so appreciate, again, the boldness of the truth telling. You know, you are obviously a truth teller. Say what you see.
Yep.
And it's desperately needed.
Yep.
And I consider myself somewhere in the neighborhood, you know, perhaps not quite as clear, perhaps not quite as bold, but I consider myself a fellow traveler on that path. And I noticed that I'm stopped in so many of my pursuits these days. This whole body of work that I do, the podcast, the online coaching, the learning series available to people who are new to the conversation and so on. I find myself getting closer and closer to just folding it up.
I suggest you do.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you to continue on that, and I'll just finish my statement by saying I so sense, with all of my spidey sense tells me that you are right on with how encased our global system is in violence. It is backed by violence at every conceivable turn.
Absolutely.
And so what you're inviting young people to do with this notion of revolution is to step forward and lean into that tsunami of violence presence in the current system. So you just said something provocative. If you'd like to follow that, like why would you suggest that I just let it go?
Well, let me go back. Let's take a look at your 2017 book. There's two premises there that we agree on. Okay, number one, that there's an existential crisis, and you do a good job of describing that with your research. The second stage in your book is that there is democracy is dead, that we're being led by an oligarchy, your word. I have quibbles with both of your analyses there, but fundamentally I agree with you, okay? We have this crisis, we have an oligarchy, so the people democratically cannot solve this. But in your book, you go in this direction. Let me just, so when you get to that stage, okay, so on page 137, to be explicit, you say the aim in the last chapters is, and I quote, the generation of an entirely new and empowered vision, mission, and purpose that could replace resistance and protest, unquote. And this very much is parallel to the Terence McKenna quote at the start, is that we have to solve this ourselves internally and not look at hierarchies or control. So at that point, my comment in my notes, I took copious notes on all this, is what the fuck, WTF,
Right.
What the fuck? The guy is telling me that we have an existential crisis. I agree with him. The guy is telling me that we're run by an oligarchy, which again, largely I agree with.
Yes.
And then I say, if you take those two things, existential crisis, domination by an oligarchy, my next step would be logically, kill the oligarchs or overthrow the oligarchs.
Yes.
But you are going to a new empowered vision, mission, and purpose that could replace resistance and protest. I don't get that. Where are you going?
Mm-hmm.
It's up to you. Tell me. Because I really, my only comment is, what the fuck? How come you went down this road? Why would you take those two premises and then go down? And is that supposed to solve the problem or reconcile people to the problem and the genocide that's unfolding? What are you trying to do with that
good
direction?
That's a really fair question. And I think it's really the same kind of question I was asking with you. What's your thoughts about, will this be a world government or will the nation states remain as post-revolution? I think it's all conjecture. And so, here we go.
No, that's not correct. This is a strategic conclusion that you draw.
I'm actually inviting an exploration that I'm projecting out into, like you're projecting out into. If we were to use strategic violence and we hit enough of the oligarchic structures to topple it, there's a possibility of something new coming forward.
Yes, but you state repeatedly that this is a gradual process. McKenna mentions that, you mention that, but we have no time for gradual processes. You're talking about here transformations in people, reconnecting to the earth, the web of life, which is exactly right, by the way. Again, we share that 100%, but you place that prior to revolutionary change. I place it after.
Yeah, good. So that's fine.
No, but that's a fundamental distinction.
It's a fundamental distinction, but I'm hearing you kind of say, but I'm certain about mine, and Dean, you're not, and so I need to find out what you're certain about. I'm making shit up. I'm making shit up, and I do hold it that what I have encountered in my own practices, in my own life experience of how transformation actually shows up in my experience, is that anything less than something like that at scale is going to fall short of what I think is necessary for the revolution you're talking about.
Okay, hold on. But we are under capitalist social control. That change will never happen under the current regime. And if it did, it would take like decades or centuries. You're talking about a protracted cultural shift. That's not going to happen. We have maybe years in front of us.
I'm totally with you. I get it. I don't think your assertions are all accurate when I map it against my own projections. We're both just projecting. So, okay, great. We got, you got one idea of what it's going to take, and I have a different one.
No, not good enough, Dean. How? No, it's not good enough. It's not a good enough response. How is this strategy, this whatever it is, new empowered vision, how does that deal with the oligarchy? How does that deal with the crisis we face? Step me through that. How does this play out? Yeah. So let's say this is achieved. What's the time frame, and how does it solve the problem?
Yeah.
How does it save the young from genocide?
Yeah, I don't hear any answers in anything so far. I haven't finished your book, to be fair, but I don't hear you answering those questions either.
Well, but then you have to read my book, Dean.
I'm going to. I'm in the middle of it.
Okay. Then we'll talk again. And so let me defer this question until you've read my full book, because you're not in a place to respond right now. Okay, so let's drop that, but we'll come back to it, because you have to tell me what your strategy is, because you haven't yet.
Okay, I don't have to, and where you've used the word ethics a few times as a cornerstone of what has really been a motivator for you and a truing. I think you call it a North Star and so on. And I totally get that, and perhaps in a later conversation we could also explore. I use a slightly different North Star, and it isn't necessarily useful in a linear conversation. Somewhere in the way that I would define or map out the territory called transformative human endeavor, things aren't so linear. Things aren't so able to be, step one, step two, followed by step three, and so on. I think it'll be a very alive conversation when we just compare notes, only they won't overlap and they won't use exactly the same terms, and they may not even be, one could be a map of my town with roads and street signs and so on, and the other could be a biospheric overlay of like what are the plants in this region and where are they, and so on, having nothing to do with the roads.
Right.
So I know that sounds vague and maybe even new agey and a little softish.
Yes, all that.
It doesn't show up for me like that. We meet at the razor's edge where your philosophy and what you're saying, and I can't wait to finish your book and we can have a more richer conversation.
Right.
But to me, there's no contrariness. There's nothing missing to be able to have an engaged, rich conversation.
Oh no, the conversation is fine. Yeah.
And
Anyway,
so,
that's fine.
Yeah. Wait, so we can pick it up later.
Okay,
Yeah.
you read the rest of my book. The other part of my work I just want to draw people's attention to is in economics. Okay,
Mhm.
I actually started all this back in the right around 1990 by developing a new economic theory. And you talk, like Naomi Klein does in one of your favorite books, This Changes Everything, about a new economic model. And one of my, you asked me earlier, what's been the response? I'm saying zero. What's been disappointing to me is that over the decades, many, many economic thinkers and just concerned people have said, we need a new economic theory. We need a new model. I've produced it. I've written a book on the topic, The Economics of Needs and Limits, and nobody gives a shit. This is what's really distressing, and what's going on. You people have been telling me for years that we need a new economic model. Again, your phrase, Klein's phrase. I produce it, and everybody turns a blind eye.
Yeah.
So I just want to make people aware that I've written two books, well, two major ones currently. The first one is the Youth Ecological Revolution, one we're talking about. The second one is the Economics of Needs and Limits, okay, which is, if we are going to move beyond capitalism, okay, again, that's not an arm-waving kind of thing. That's a very concrete. What are you going to do with the institutions? What about markets? What about profits? What about this? What about its logic? You got to attack all those things concretely, okay, which I do in detail in that second book, okay? And I hope that you'll help me get people to look at that critically. It's just a starting point, but look at that critically and ask themselves, is this a good starting point for a post-capitalist sustainable economic model or theory?
Great.
Okay, that's the second part of my work. I don't expect you to read that book. It's a bit technical. Just finish. In chapter 7 of Youth Ecological Revolution, I do a high-level overview. So if you don't want to read that book, chapter 7 should suffice to give you an idea, okay? Also, it links to a fairly detailed introduction to the whole mode of thought.
Right.
But anyway, go ahead, but please make people aware that that's available as well.
I look forward to it, and I'll be sure to get each links and names of the books you're talking about, any links to further information that you might be able to offer. I'll put it all in the show notes. I'm curious, just a brief next piece on what you're describing about your work in economics. Is there anybody out there that folks could draw a thread to any portion of their work? I'm thinking Kate Rayworth and Donut Economics or whatever. Is there anybody that has even a small portion that could kind of point toward what you're suggesting in your interpretation of an economic revolution?
Kate Raworth is a good person to mention, her Donut Economics. It's a useful book for background in economic thought and progressive economic policies. I discuss it in my book, as you'll see, chapter 7. But she doesn't talk about a new economic theory, a new economic framework, or in your terms, a new economic model. It is simply basically a description of economic history, some basic principles, and then some progressive kind of policies, etc. But there is no economic theory there. Where else would it be? Again, there isn't anything else. There is no. The person I've drawn on is historical, John Ruskin. Back in about 1870 or so, he wrote a couple of books, Unto This Last and another book, which I've drawn some basic concepts from. But aside from Ruskin, economically, you know, Schumacher and a few other people have said some good things, but in terms of developing a post-capitalist framework, in other words, what is the theory of value? What do we value? How do we define cost? What are ecological limits and how do they relate to those two? How do we distinguish between needs and wants? You know, the fundamental economic questions. That is the starting point, and that's a starting point for me, but I don't see that being a starting point for anybody else, including people like Kate Raworth. So again, it's a wasteland. I'm throwing this stuff into a wasteland, I got to say, you know, of basically unresponsiveness and puzzled. What the hell are you doing? When people have been asking for exactly this sort of thing. Where is our new economic theory? Here it is. Oh, well, we don't care. This has puzzled the hell out of me. It's not even revolutionary. There's no revolution in that book. It is just, how do we think about production and consumption and allocation and distribution, the fundamental economic issues. I don't know. Something has to break. Something has to shatter in this society. And I do talk about that in chapter 6 of Youth Ecological Revolution, that something fundamental has to change. And I'm thinking of things like a military takeover somewhere. Some nation like India, once they're boiling, they say, fuck you people, we're going to do SRM. We're going to send those planes up and we're going to distribute aerosols. We know it's going to be damaging, but we are dying. It's 55 degrees in the shade down here. We can't live. That could happen, okay? Climate science could split, because let's face it, climate science in its messaging, not its research, but in its messaging is equicidal bullshit, led by Michael Mann, but they're all guilty. There has to be a breakaway within climate science, and I have an appendix in my book, which is a public statement by those potential breakaway climate scientists. So let's say that happens next year. Okay, 50 climate scientists sign on to my or some modified statement. And you should read that, by the way. It's Appendix C. And say, we no longer believe the Michael Mann bullshit. We no longer believe the emission reduction story, 1.5 global warming. To hell with that. We need global cooling, and this is how we're going to achieve it. Okay, that could be earth rattling or shaking. And even within the ruling class itself, those are people. Okay, very brutal and rich people and powerful people, but they are people, and there are a lot of good people among them. And some may say at some point, we can't do this anymore. We are not competent to lead. We are leading people into this disaster, and there may be a split in the ruling class or the state. So these things at the human level are necessary to shatter this carapace of indolence, of passivity. And as we saw with last summer, with those intense weather especially in your area, you talked about the fires with
Sure.
Elliot.
Mhm.
Of course, you know where I live in BC here in British Columbia.
Yes.
We had the same stuff. So we felt this viscerally. Okay,
Mhm.
this is a new world that we're living in. Anyway, my point was going to be that despite those events, despite those earth-shattering events at COP26 in Glasgow in November, so after many of them had occurred, they still went with the same capitalist bullshit. And that, to me, as I know it in chapter 1, is for me definitive proof that this will continue until the whole thing blows up.
Yeah.
Nothing is going to change these people's minds.
Yeah.
If you're not revolutionary now, you never will be.
Yeah.
Okay, this is a revolutionary situation. Let's not kid ourselves.
Yeah.
I know it's daunting. It's daunting to me because you can see the chaos that's going to and the violence that will. But if it doesn't happen, we're all dead, and mostly the young will probably die in our beds. They'll die flooded, or starved, or burned, and that is genocide, and we know it. And if we don't revolt, we are complicit in that genocide.
Yeah.
That's my view.
Yeah. Frank Rotering, you again, I just want to thank you for the boldness of your seeing, the boldness of the voice that you use so well in your writing. And I'm looking so forward to our subsequent conversations when I get, the fuller picture of particularly this Youth Ecological Revolution book. There's such a crackling realness to what you're talking about that I've been starved for in so many of my conversations, even with very collapse-aware people, and it sounds like you've had years and years of similar kind of frustrating, not quite there conversations with people.
Yep.
And so the best I can offer right now is my thanks for your truth-telling and for your passionate commitment to that ethically founded stand you've taken and then articulated. It's really a pleasure, and I just really look forward to our subsequent conversations, and I wish you some kind of unforeseen, unpredictable breakthrough in being seen, in being heard.
Yes, thank you.
I can only wish that.
Okay, well, thank you. That was very eloquent and moving. So I deeply appreciate what you just said. Thank you.
And I look forward to booking our next one. So get ready.
Okay. Read that book.
Okay.
Read that book. Okay.
Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance. www.livingresilience.net. Music today from Michael Hedges, as always, and also Port Blue Into the Sea.
Also available on our website, www.livingresilience.net, is a wide array of articles, online learning series, arranging group and individual resilience coaching, and sign up for our every other Tuesday free support group that we call Safe Circle Calls.